Welcome to Chapter 17, The Triumph of Industrialism. In the 50 years following the American Civil War, the United States became the largest and richest industrialized nation in the world. In 1880, agriculture still played a large role in the average American's income, but just 10 years later, manufacturing doubled agriculture's output. In 1913, 1/3 of all of the world's manufacturing came from the United States. Entrepreneurial skills proved to be an important asset at this time. Gustavus Swift was one of these early entrepreneurs. His Shark Tank-worthy idea was shipping meat to consumers. Until then, all meat was butchered and sold locally simply because meat wouldn't keep long enough to do it any other way. With expanding railroads, though, and the introduction of the refrigerated rail car, things changed. Swift sent his first refrigerated beef by train in the mid-1870s. At first, there was concern. Consumers worried that the meat wouldn't be safe to eat because it would spoil on the way to them. And local butchers were concerned, though, that they would lose business, and they even tried to get the practice outlawed. Within a few years, though, the trend caught on, and the meatpacking industry began to grow. Thomas Edison invented many gadgets in his lifetime, but the light bulb was arguably his most important. Until the light bulb, people had no choice but to work and play during the daylight hours. Gas lights were used in city streets, in wealthier neighborhoods, and in some upper-class homes. Kerosene was a cheap alternative, but it was really dangerous because it was so flammable. So, like any entrepreneur today would do, Edison set out to find investors to make his idea a reality. He wanted to find a stable filament for this glass bulb that he invented. Within a few years, urban Americans were able to stay up later to read, to talk, to dine, or just generally enjoy themselves. When we hear the name Andrew Carnegie today, we likely think of Carnegie Hall, which is a famous concert venue in Manhattan. It was funded by Andrew Carnegie, another entrepreneur of this area. Carnegie was a self-made man who made his way to the top with focus on cost efficiency and ruthless cost-cutting tactics in many cases. He didn't invent anything. His talent was working with things that already existed, like existing technology, and then making them show a profit. In the 1860s, he concentrated on the iron and steel industry. He kept labor costs low by mechanizing as much as possible. So basically, he replaced people with machinery whenever he could. He drove steel prices down so much that they were so much cheaper than any of the other building options, including the more inferior building options like lumber or iron. So Carnegie created basically the steel industry. He gave away much of his fortune to a variety of charities in the long run, including public libraries. In Arkansas, there are several Carnegie-funded libraries. They're in Eureka Springs, Fort Smith, Little Rock, and Morrilton. Also, J.P. Morgan's name may be one you're familiar with. It may be on your credit card. During the industrialization era, more people saved money than they do today. On average, back then, Americans tucked back 25% of their earnings. There were attempts at investment banking before Morgan, but one ended in the economic depression in 1873, which did nothing to promote investment banking at all. In the 1880s, then, Morgan came back and began promoting the stock market. People trusted him to make a profit, and he used that to earn the trust of consumers, and he rallied support for what has become the present-day system of investment banking. And here's a picture of J.P. Morgan. Looks like Grandpa, maybe. Wish he was Grandpa. So while we look back on men like Swift and Edison, Carnegie and Morgan, and we see their accomplishments in the U.S. economy, there are others who are called spoilers because they ruined competitors, rigged prices, they cheated or bribed politicians to get their way or to financially benefit. So let's talk about the spoilers of that era. Fighting in the Civil War slowed railroad construction. In 1865, there were only 35,000 miles of rail track in the United States, but by 1890, just shortly after the Civil War, that grew to 167,000 miles. By the time 1910 rolled around, Americans were connected by more than 240,000 miles of railway. Jay Gould is one of these spoilers. He made his fortune by manipulating railroads' financial structure and then leaving them with crippling debt. He and a partner were made directors of the Erie Railroad as allies of New York Railroad promoter Cornelius Vanderbilt. You might recognize that Vanderbilt name, and the Vanderbilts we have in the fashion industry come from this gentleman. Gould and his business partner betrayed Vanderbilt by stock watering, which is when you issue a lot of new stocks that are unjustified by market increase. So they were just loading stocks into the market. Vanderbilt tried to buy a majority of those stocks so he could gain control. And when he spent a lot of money to buy those, Gould and his partners dumped the stocks, which basically meant they just cheated Vanderbilt into buying stocks that had absolutely no value, took his money, and then ran with it, dumping him with worthless stock. Another one of these spoilers is John D. Rockefeller. He's remembered for his monopoly in the oil refining business. His Standard Oil Company quickly became one of the biggest on the market. He negotiated cheaper shipping with railways and gained the edge over his competitors, who often then had no choice but to sell out to him. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled 90 to 95% of the country's refining operations and 92% of the crude oil from the Appalachians. In 1882, Rockefeller formed the First Trust, which is a company that owned the securities of a subsidiary firm and controlled all the operations. In 1911, though, the Supreme Court dissolved that trust into 30 separate firms. However, it remained the largest producer of refined oil and crude petroleum in the world. And this shows an example of the railroad tracks that were available in the United States from 1850 to 1900. The era of industrialization began a rags to riches kind of myth that Americans and immigrants to our country clung to. This entrepreneurial idea was that anyone could make it big if they just worked hard enough. People of the time valued reliability, thrift, sobriety, respectability, and honesty. But work ethic and the promise of reaching your American dream through it had another side. It also justified those who were not successful. This idea that if you were not successful, you just weren't working hard enough had an impact on society. It didn't take into account the realities of birthright or just plain old luck. Also, some preachers even began teaching that material possessions and wealth were signs of God's favor. So if you were a poor person during this era who struggled to feed your family, the public perception of you was that you were lazy and not in God's favor. It's pretty harsh. The federal government made some direct investments in infrastructure during this time, things like docks, canals, and post offices. In 1867, taxpayers paid $1.2 million for these projects. By 1895, they cost about $20 million. At the same time, local governments also charged taxes to build things that were needed locally, like hospitals, and to pave streets, build sewers, and make schools. Between 1861 and 1872, the federal government imposed an income tax. It was dropped briefly during the Civil War because of economic hard times. When they tried to reinforce it again later in 1894, the Supreme Court stepped in and declared it unconstitutional. The biggest part of that tax burden fell on people with lower incomes and farmers, and created a subsidy of sorts for richer business people. The system clearly was not fair. The hands-off policy was promoted by federal courts who favored business. The courts refused to impose restraints on business practices, which is how the hands-off policy got its name. From 1865 to 1880, federal courts upheld the states that that states could restrict the exercise of private property rights to protect the health, welfare, or morals of its citizens. But in the 1880s, federal courts shifted. They began to limit the power states had over businesses. They were influenced by social Darwinism. Scientific Darwinism discussed the idea of survival of the fittest in nature. Social Darwinism, then, is the idea that there was also a survival of the fittest theory that applied to society and economics. So now we move on to the wage earners of the era. The wage earners primarily in this time frame were white males who made up the majority of the paid labor force. Real income increased by 50% in this era simply because there were jobs and people took them and worked. The living conditions and working conditions improved. There were long hours, but living conditions improved because people were making more money. Work conditions were often unsafe and unhealthy, though, and rapid technology changes made some skills suddenly obsolete. It's just like today with computer technology. You can buy a computer 1 year and then within months it's obsolete because something else has replaced it. Same was true then with their technology, even though it was mostly machinery based. Moving on to working class protest. The Depression of the 1870s brought about hard times and the decline of labor unions. Jobs were hard to come by, so fewer people were just willing to strike. Also damaging the image of unions was suspected union violence. The Knights of Labor started in Philadelphia as a union of tailors. When they successfully forced Jay Gould to abandon a 10% wage cut in 1885, membership in that organization grew by leaps and bounds. The Knights of Labor had some setbacks, though. After being the most powerful due to its size, membership started to fall. Union members struggled with their purpose. They couldn't decide if they were a lodge, like a fraternal lodge, a political lobbyist, or a straight-up labor union. They also never really reached a decision on whether or not to recruit Black men to join as members. As they watched membership fall amid their indecisiveness, there was one final straw, the Haymarket Riot of 1886. McCormick Harvester Company locked out 1,400 union members for demanding an 8-hour workday and a $2 daily wage. That's not $2 an hour, that's a $2 daily wage. The company brought in scabs, who are replacement workers that were not union members, and the union members attacked their replacements. Police responded by opening fire on the union members. On May 4th, 3,000 men and women gathered in orderly fashion at Haymarket Square, but a bomb was set off as police advanced toward them. As a result, 70 police officers were killed. No one knows exactly who set the bomb off, but the event gave people a reason not to trust unions any longer. The American Federation of Labor began in 1886, started by a group of former socialists. The union concentrated efforts on native-born workers and confined membership only to skilled tradesmen. Under the leadership of Samuel Gompers, the AFL endorsed volunteerism and best policies for workers. They concentrated on collective bargaining to improve work conditions, and they worked toward an 8-hour workday, better wages, and better job conditions. Gompers said socialism was foolish. Still, socialism began to gain some traction following the release of Karl Marx's Das Kapital. It predicted capitalism would be defeated. Marx's theory gave hope to the poor and the powerless. In 1877, the Socialist Labor Party, became the chief socialist organization in the United States. The Homestead Strike of 1892 was the labor union's worst defeat. It took place in Homestead, Pennsylvania at Carnegie Steel Company. Carnegie's lieutenant introduced new technology, saying that it would increase productivity and increase wages for those who worked by the piece. But he simultaneously said that piece rates would be reduced. The Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers went on strike. In June 1893, even the plant's unskilled workers joined the strike, and they sealed off the plant. The company advertised for strike breakers. The governor sent 8,000 soldiers to the plant and seized it from the strikers. The company lieutenant said they would no longer deal with that union. An anarchist stabbed the lieutenant, but he survived. Another depression followed the Panic of 1893, making socialism the topic of the day again. It weakened confidence in the capitalist system. Eugene Debs was a charismatic leader in the Pullman strike of 1894, and he became important in the growing socialist movement in the country. Pullman Company owner George Pullman invented the railway sleeping car. He built a huge factory and created a community with plenty of housing and amenities for his employees, but he charged those people dearly to live there. When orders for the sleeping car declined, he laid off workers, but he kept the rents as high as ever. Debs tried to negotiate, but when that fell through, he convinced railroad switchmen not to connect those sleeping cars. The federal government intervened, and Debs went to prison for 6 months for his defiance. Debs became the leader of the Socialist Party of America, which never grew strong enough to really challenge the United States two-party election system. And this is a photo inside the McCormick factory in Chicago. So we're actually getting to the point in history where we have real photographs now that collected images for us to see. In conclusion, industrialism brought about the best and the worst of America. Skill, intelligence, and drive propelled change and progress. Ruthlessness and greed changed things too. Labor unions tried to seek better conditions for employees, but often ended in violence. Ultimately, Americans refused to accept radical solutions and continued moving forward with their mainstream political parties and their capitalist economy.